Hey guys, so while doing the editing on a recent spaces that we did on Twitter regarding fascism, National Socialism in the Weltanschauung, and its root origins that I try to prove that were Christian, Catholic in nature, I've been going through the editing process and I realize I probably need to do a short preface right here. And the preface should really indicate or clarify the issue of the importance of being objective about this subject. It's an emotionally charged subject for everybody that studies it that's really not familiar with it. Okay. And if you're going to ask the question, am I a National Socialist? I commit to Catholic integralism as a political philosophy. I believe the best form of political administration is monarchy under a Catholic form of government and policy. And I think that can be demonstrated in a republic. As Socrates pointed out, a republic is a monarchy. And but he can be elected by the Senate or chosen by the Senate. And that's somewhat what we have, a rough form of that in America at the time. So the point is that I myself also have to be objective. I'm a philosophy nerd. I'm a historian nut. I have studied World War II history to have questions answered about this subject. But the reason why this subject is so important to the Western man, not to be committed to it, but to understand why it's hung, this subject is hung around all of our necks as a political weapon, a psychological weapon of guilt, so that none of us defend ourselves. So it's important to get to the root of World War II history, Third Reich history, its origins, its influence, and that influence doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens through people. So the people that formed this worldview, that formed the Third Reich, that formed this politic and committed to its actions, you have to ask the question, where did they get it from? Where did it come from? And as I point out, and I talk clearly about this, and by no means is this the most extensive, concise encyclopedia. This will be a beginning of a series of talks, hopefully, if it's received well. But people before World War II that were interested in leadership and at least that part of the guardian class of political philosophy and politics and involvement in the post-monarch Europe, they were very much involved with and studying with the German philosophers of the time, even the ancient Greek philosophers. And I point this out: Pythagoras, Aristotle, Plato, Epicurus, that went into a lot of so-called Enlightenment era philosophers. Of course, you go into David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Baruch Spinoza, Rene Descartes, and you go all the way up to a more modern day, and that would be, of course, Martin Heidegger. And so the question is, do any of these people, and did any of these people have an influence on people like Gottfried Feder, Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, Leon de Grille, even in Spain, Franco? And I answer that very clearly. And a lot of us have had these talks on these things, including people that I don't interact with, but I enjoy some of his videos, which is, of course, the Millerman podcast. And I think Millerman does a pretty good job in analyzing Julius Evola and several others on this subject. He did a good analysis on Julius Evola's notes on the Third Reich. But he, as well as Julius Evola, I think don't really approach it in the same way that I would. And I've spoken about this before, that most of the modern era philosophers have abandoned worldview philosophy. And worldview philosophy was resurrected from Immanuel Kant onward. Now, not everybody embraced that concept. In fact, Julius Evola also had a worldview of dualism, but he himself rejected and attacked Christianity as something that was holding Western civilization back and the coming man back. He especially hated Catholicism. So he had a worldview, but his worldview, as well as others that I demonstrate, like Schopenhauer, were contradictory. And they're contradictory not just illogically within their own worldview, but also contradictory to Catholicism. And why is that important? Because, as I point out, that Hitler himself was a student of people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and Heidegger and others. But he had a knack for being able to study these things without committing to the entirety of the worldview of that writer, of that philosopher. And what was his worldview? Well, as I demonstrate here in this talk and several other places, he called himself a Catholic. He was raised a Catholic. He lived as a Catholic, maybe not a good Catholic, but he was a Catholic. And he died as a Catholic. And he made these declarations, and others around him identified him as a son of the Catholic Church. Now people spurg out and they say he was pagan, he's this and that. And that's what this talk is about. It's to handle the clarity of so many misconceptions, lies, post-World War II propaganda. Let's get to the actual facts of the matter without being committed to this worldview. Not committed to the outcome of National Socialism or resurrecting the Third Reich or starting a Fourth Reich. I'm just simply committing as an academic, a philosophy nerd, a history nerd, the effect that this subject has on people and the Western man in general. So much so that he doesn't want to approach it. But how important is it to understand the subject when everybody, right and left, so-called right and left, hurls accusations at each other like, you're a fascist, no, you're a fascist, no, you're a Nazi, no, you're a Nazi. It doesn't have any meaning anymore. I want to know what the original meaning is, okay? I want to know how it applies in a logical, consistent way without, of course, like I said, being committed to it. What is the actual political philosophy itself, right? And so when one reads Mein Kampf, in Mein Kampf 2, and other interviews and speeches from Hitler and speeches from Stryker and speeches from Himmler and Goebbels, as well as Mussolini and Leon Degrille's books like The Burning Soul and so forth, then you come to understand that there is a continuity of a theme throughout all of these writings, throughout all of these leaders. And the continuity in their theme is that they were specifically tasked, as they say, by destiny, by God, by the Lord Almighty, by this type of verbiage, as being stalwart soldiers against the spread of Bolshevism, nihilism, communism, Marxism, and to protect Christianity. Now, you can disagree with the tactics used in protecting Christianity, but many of the people that complain about how Christianity is protected, they also complain also about how the Crusades protected Christian lands after being occupied by Muslims. But now the modern day is, the outcry is from friends that are allies, that are Muslims, that are Jews, that are atheists, that are other types. They say, why is Christianity so weak? Stand up for yourself. So people can't make up their mind. Do they want Christian European men to be strong, or do they want us to just lay down? Because it seems like for the past century, we've laid down and become more liberal and open, and now they accuse us of being weak when everybody runs us over, right? And why do so many Western Christian and atheist men just sit there and let everybody run us over? It's this subject. It's this subject of World War II history, of the Third Reich, of fascism in general, right? And so you have to remove this fear. And as Plato and other philosophers talked about, fear and all the other negative emotions that a man may have, which is another passion he can be controlled by, can only be eradicated from knowledge, experience, logic, reason, understanding. First, starting with knowledge, accurate knowledge, epignosis. And so you don't have to be an expert on this, but you have to know the particulars, at least the foundational principles. And as I prove in this talk, and other talks I've already done too, National Socialism, fascism, has its roots and its foundations in Catholic integralism, which is Catholic political philosophy, okay? So you don't have to commit to that to understand that. You don't have to commit to the genetic fallacy either and say, I don't care if that's the case, they hurt people and said mean things. Isn't that what we're facing today? People are realizing you can have mean things and bad things happen in any empire, in any country, in any politic, in any army, okay? The idea is not to look at the accidentals of the people enacting a policy. The idea is to look at the policy and the principles themselves, okay? Just wrap your head around that concept and let's go for it. Welcome back to the Why We Fight Boot Camp. This will be episode 2. Today we're going to be speaking about fascism, National Socialism, and what is the Weltanschauung. This is going to be going into the origins of the political philosophy, study it objectively as academics, and identify the implausibility of what many claim to be, that it was rooted in the German philosophical worldviews like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and so forth, and not in Christian philosophy. And we'll prove that it was actually very much rooted in Christian philosophy and its universals as symbolized in some of the symbology of fascism and the Third Reich. So first we're going to do opening prayer. Forgot to mention this is July 9th, 2024, just so we have it as a timestamp in the record. So we're going to have opening prayer from Servium. If you can give us prayer, we can get started after that.
Nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. O God, come to my assistance. O Lord, make haste to help me. Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me in thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear unto the words of my mouth. For strangers have risen up against me, and the mighty have sought after my soul, and they have not set God before their eyes. For behold, God is my helper, and the Lord is the protector of my soul. Turn back evil upon mine enemies, and destroy them in the truth. I will freely sacrifice unto thee, and will give thanks to thee name. O Lord, for it is good. For thou hast delivered me out of all my trouble, and mine eye hath looked down upon mine enemies. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Jesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et hora mortis nostrae. Amen. Nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancti.
Amen. Hail Christ.
Hail Mary.
Hail Mary.
So as the interest in World War II history emerges, so does the confusion on the subject, especially when it comes to the use of the terms fascist and Nazi as a pejorative slur against anybody the aggressor doesn't understand in any argument. Further complicating the issue and avoiding the self-defined characteristics of this philosophy. That's what most people do. They avoid defining them from the self-defined definitions, and they want to assign them themselves. So arbitrary once again. So today I'd like to address less of the events of World War II history and more of the causes of the political philosophy of fascism and its adjacent forms like National Socialism, and dispel some of the myths and misunderstandings of this politic. Now, it's an emotionally charged subject too, so in order to approach it, we have to be as objective as possible and without also committing to the subject matter itself. All we should be seeking are the facts and the causality of the subject at hand. So now if we take that academic approach, I would say the single greatest help in categorizing the particulars of this subject is to understand the concept of the Weltanschauung, which of course is the German term popularized in the modern era by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, due to his effort to refute David Hume's abandonment of worldview philosophies and the philosophical category of metaphysics in general, thereby reinstituting the traditional position that particulars of a worldview cannot and do not exist on their own, but are an emergence from an existing overall worldview. And that if those particulars are removed from that worldview, then its entirety would collapse upon itself. Another stumbling block on this subject is of a more serious consequence, and that is the claim that the Third Reich was pagan, or at least non-Christian in its philosophical origin. But as I will demonstrate today, that is an illogical and, dare I say, an implausible conclusion. As an important note regarding philosophy and individual schools of philosophy, I'll just say this. Don't get intimidated by unfamiliar terms you may hear. Just ask questions when we take breaks between segments to clarify, and then we'll move on to the next segment. Also, don't think when I talk about Immanuel Kant, Plato, Descartes, Nietzsche, and others, you have to understand all the particulars about their philosophy and writings, because you don't. I'm going to give you a decoder lens that will help you with this issue. And I spoke about this in episode 1 when discussing Christian nationalism. No matter how many philosophers there have been in the past, whether they are from ancient Greece, Rome, Christian, Jewish, Muslim philosophers, all of them write from a particular worldview. And essentially, there are only 4 major worldviews that each one conforms to, excluding the Christian worldview. They are monism, dualism, atomism, and pragmatism. So when one is trying to understand the entirety of Aristotle, one doesn't need to understand all the particulars of his writings to understand the end goal in describing the worldview he comports to. You only need to be familiar with that worldview. He's a monist, by the way. So if you already have a presupposition and certain understanding of what monism is, and you approach a study of somebody like Aristotle and know he's a monist, you already have a context in understanding how he's going to convince you of his worldview. So how important do you think that is when approaching the study of a particular philosopher like Martin Heidegger, Baruch Spinoza, or David Hume? Right? So understanding this is like having a decoder ring. If you know specifically that Plato, for instance, was a dualist, then you'll understand that everything he argues for will share characteristics with all other forms of dualism like Buddhism and Taoism, as well as its end result, which is the annihilation of everything at the end of the cosmos. So there's a commonality and probably a common origin with dualism, with monism, with atomism, right? So that is a very simple way to understand how to interpret every single philosopher and philosophy in general when you run across them. You don't need to know everything about them, even when it comes to somebody like Thomas Aquinas, at least regarding those outside Catholic philosophical realm. And I'll explain what I mean by that later on. But every single one of these philosophers are only taking a different approach to try to make a justification for the intelligibility of their particular worldview. And as we'll find out, and I'll argue for, all 4 of those worldviews are unintelligible and definitely cannot be intelligible justifications for the politics of monarchism, nationalism, integralism, fascism, or National Socialism. They cannot be the causality of those politics. So we'll cover this rather vast subject as quickly as we can, and I'll break it down into 4 major points, 4 major subjects. First, I'm going to define fascism, its origins and its relation to worldview philosophy. Second, I'll define the German philosophers, their worldviews, and whether or not they are the plausible origin of fascism and National Socialism. The third subject will be the origin of the swastika and the tetrakitis, how and why Pythagoras chose this symbol he created to convey the unification between heaven and man. And the fourth subject will be why we can definitively conclude that fascism and the Third Reich are rooted in Christian philosophy, specifically Catholic philosophy. Okay, so let's get started. So the first one is about fascism's definition and how it self-defines its own worldview. So if somebody obtains a copy of a dictionary that existed before World War II, like I've obtained, he can clearly see that fascism is not defined as communist. It's not defined as democratic. It's not defined as left-wing. And remember, National Socialism is a form of fascism. Same thing with phalangism. It's a form of fascism, right? And so to say that National Socialism is a form of socialism because it has the word socialism in it, which is the major mistake most of these libertarians and democracy advocates talk about. They're taking it once again upon themselves, upon the man to define it without doing any research. And if you read the definition in an older pre-World War II dictionary, it specifically says here, first, fascisti, an Italian organization originated in 1919 by patriots to oppose all the radical elements in the country. Everybody knows at that time, contextually, radical elements meant Marxist revolutionaries. Fascist movement underneath that. The movement towards nationalism and conservatism, as opposed to internationalism and radicalism, Marxism, originated by the fascisti, or the fascistes, the party, in Italy. right? So now what we have self-defined is not subjective, it's objective, now that we've defined it. And that's the difference between talking to a modernist and talking to somebody actually educated on the subject. Now we've established a subjective, self-defined definition. It's not left-wing. So what is the origin also of the philosophical influences on Mussolini, de Grelle, Hitler, Franco, Rivera? Where did it come from? Most will say it came from paganism, came from general philosophy of the modern era at the time. But where did it come from, and where were the greatest influences? And more so, where were the symbols coming from? The fascisti, the Hakenkreuz or swastika. Where do they come from? Well, first let's cover the declarations by Hitler, or I should say Mussolini himself. Without going into a deep history about Mussolini, in his younger days, he was self-declared socialist Marxist, and much of that had to do with his abandonment of Catholicism. And he grew up as a Catholic. Later on in years, he developed a relationship with an obscure priest named Father Padre Pio, who was also a self-declared fascist. After several discussions with him, he was convinced to revert back to his Catholic faith again. And in doing so, he realized how incompatible Catholicism was with communism. And if he was going to fight for the continuity and the existence of Italy and Western civilization in general, he could not do so while also believe in the communist politic, because it negates Christianity. And upon his reversion back to his faith and his rise in political power, he developed his fascist political philosophy and even a manifesto regarding the subject. And he made many declarations about the importance of being Catholic if you're going to stay in this fight against the spread of Marxism and communism and preserve the continuity of Europe, right? So once he became the leader of Italy, he received the Lateran Treaty from the Catholic Church in 1929, which endorsed his political philosophy and his government and praised it for its efforts to protect Christians from nihilism and the spread of communism. So we can clearly see that Mussolini's fascism was Christian in both nature and demonstrated ethics, the proactive praxis or implementation of these particular values, ethics. Now, when it comes to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, and the fact that it had its origins that dated back even before 1919, which means that before Hitler ever met Gottfried Feder while on book tour and lecture in Munich, the party was already being developed by the first adherents. And so Hitler, when he actually joined the party after meeting Gottfried Feder at one of his lectures in Munich, he was being brought into an already existing group, even if it wasn't fully self-defined. And eventually he became the leader of that party. And even before he was appointed as Chancellor of Germany later on, I believe in 1933. But before all that, the NSDAP developed a declaration of desires and demands of the government and representation of the German people called the 25 Points of the NSDAP. And it's very telling when you understand the nature of their movement and what it was about when you read point 24. Point 24 makes it very clear. It says, "We demand freedom of religion for all religious denominations within the state, so long as they do not endanger its existence or oppose the moral senses of the Germanic people. The party as such advocates the standpoint of a positive Christianity, without binding itself confessionally to any one denomination. It combats the Jewish materialistic spirit within and around us and is convinced that a lasting recovery of our nation can only succeed from within one framework. Common utility precedes individual utility." So you could see it didn't say that we are going to ban religion like Marxism and calls it a poison. It says that it advocates Christianity. Now, some people get all bent out of shape when it says we don't bind itself to a confession, but you got to remember, practically all the founders of all fascist movements were Catholic. But if you're in Germany, you have a large population that's not Catholic. So how do you get people to join in your idea, not force convert them, but work with them as allies? You'd have to say something like that. So later on in 1938, after Hitler had already been on the cover of Time magazine 4 times, been a very popular person, especially amongst, ironically, the socialists. And it was the first country to pull itself out of a depression. Their depression was called the Weimar Republic, and had already hosted the Berlin Olympics. And they were already talking about nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize or the Nobel Prize in 1939. So in a speech he made on December 28th, 1938, he made a declaration in his definition of socialism, although he had already made it as such in Mein Kampf and other speeches. He says, quote, "A socialist is one who serves the common good without giving up his individuality or personality or the product of his personal efficiency. Our adopted term socialist has nothing to do with Marxian socialism. Marxism is anti-property. True socialism is not. Marxism places no value on the individual or individual effort or efficiency. True socialism values the individual and encourages him in individual efficiency, at the same time holding that his interest as an individual must be in consonance with those of the community. All great inventions, discoveries, achievements were first the product of an individual brain. It is charged against me that I am against property, that I am an atheist. Both are false charges." So you see what he's saying? People claim that he's an atheist and he's a socialist that denies the right to property. He says both charges are false. So without going to Alex Jones, Owen Schroyer, Fox News, or anybody else out there that's obviously not read anything on the subject, we can see that the subjects themselves, the politics themselves, are already subjectively self-defined and therefore become objectively true, at least in concept, conceptually, even if they're not implemented 100% that way. Now, the other accusations that are held against Hitler, the Third Reich, and movements like this is that they were pagan in nature. And it's ironic because the other fascists of the day were never accused as such. Was anybody ever in doubt, and has anybody made an entire campaign against Mussolini to declare and define him as pagan? Was anybody out there in Spain trying to declare Rivera and then Franco pagan? No, there's no foundation for it. And so the accusation comes from those trying to undermine the entire philosophy itself, the political philosophy of National Socialism and fascism itself. And so, again, one doesn't have to be committed to the outcome of this research. One just has to understand that those making these accusations can't be true because they haven't proven them to be true, right? And so we could do that both with more empirical proofs regarding his repudiation of paganism, at least proactive paganism, and the demonstrable proofs that we can show through implication as well. One of them is from a New York Times article that somebody had shared with me a few years ago, and it was from 1935, and it was very soon after he got appointed and took the chancellorship. And this New York Times article that's titled "Hitler Repudiates Reich Neo-Pagans and Backs Christianity." The subheading, of course, says, "Führer to lead the party along path of a positive faith, moved by Schott." And the whole thing goes into dictator is said to have given pledges to the Catholic bishop during parley in Berlin. He actually locked up pagans that were against the NSDAP and colluded with Marxists in a violent manner as well. And so they became outlawed eventually too. So even the press in America, in New York Times, that's always trying to take a pejorative against anything right wing, couldn't do anything but report the facts as they were. So he repudiates Reich neo-pagans, backs Christianity, met with the Catholic bishop in Berlin at the time, and made an agreement, a written agreement. And soon before, not too long before that, he also received a Reichskonkordat from Pope Pius XI and was reaffirmed by Pope Pius XII. So would they do that if he was pagan or pro-pagan? Obviously not, because in the Concordat, which is a legal document recognizing the legitimacy of a particular government or politic, it specifically says in there that it recognizes the Third Reich under Hitler's chancellorship that it was protecting the Catholic Church. So it's very clear from the church, all of the support from the episcopate and the party, as well as Hitler's own declarations, that he is German, he was born Catholic, he will die Catholic, and he will never give in to another creed and give up Christianity. So I can go into a lot of other proofs, but that's it for that section. So if anybody had any questions or commentary, you can add it now, and we'll try to handle that before we go into the next section.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, just for commentary, I thought I'd add in some definitions of Gottfried Feder on socialism. So yeah, like you mentioned, Gottfried Feder, he was already in the party before Hitler was in it, and Hitler considered him basically the catechist of National Socialism. So that's why his definitions matter. So his definition of socialism he mentions here, he says, Mammonism is the direct opposite of socialism. Socialism conceived as the highest moral idea, as the idea that man is not in the world only for himself alone, that every man has duties towards the community, toward all humanity, and that he is not only responsible for the momentary well-being of his family, of the members of his tribe, of his folk, but that he also has unshakable moral obligations toward the future of his children and his folk. And then different definition, he says, we by contrast demand radical rejection of the mammonistic state and a reconstruction of the state according to the true spirit of socialism, in which the ruling basic idea is the obligation to nourish, in which an old basic demand of communism can find its rational and useful satisfaction in the form that every member of the folk shall receive his assigned entitlement to the soil of the homeland through the state's allocation of the most important foodstuffs.
And what does that sound like? What does that social policy sound like? Does it sound like atheism? Or
sounds like an encyclical.
Right. That's the whole point. And that's the point that most Protestants in the modern day don't get, that the Protestants of that time understood, at least the High Lutherans, which shared, maybe outside of some definitions of justification and so forth, they understood what the social responsibility was. And even those that were American Protestants still at that time understood through implication, through demonstration, and through historical environment. They knew that you're in an environment of a Catholic, or I should say Christian nature, but obviously its origins were from Catholic. And so you have to have a social doctrine that you put others before yourself. How are we not like that if we are good fathers and husbands and looking out for a neighbor? I mean, that's explicit social policy from Catholicism. So how can one say that one believes in atomism and atheism and nihilism and cutting your ear off and giving yourself syphilis and believing that we're not really present here, monism like Schopenhauer, yet at the same time we should be responsible to the preservation of Christian society fighting the spread of Bolshevism and nihilism? You don't have a justification for doing that. We do. And we can prove that through demonstration of a historical application of that worldview. Of course, that worldview entails the social policy. And that's why that when Protestants in the modern day hear that initially, they reel back and they say, what are you, a Marxist? What are you, a communist? Because they've never heard an implemented social policy regarding your neighbors. They're so hyper individualistic.
For the austerity of those who encounter this question, how would you sort of combat, I believe it was like the 1933 election, where you can see the Catholic demographic largely voted for, kind of like the center party, the Christian Democrat Party, whereas mostly Protestants voted for National Socialism? How would you sort of combat that question? Well, look, none of the Catholics even voted for him.
Right. So a variable that needs to be understood in that context is that many of the Catholic activists of the time were not, as we would know now, traditional Catholic. They were very much socialist Marxist in nature, not socialist nationalist in nature, and definitely not traditional Catholic in nature. We've got to remember it wasn't just Vatican II It goes back a long time where these groups have begun to abandon not just dogma but social policy. Like, for instance, everybody knows about the attempted assassinations of the Catholic Church and two popes blessed Chancellor of Germany. Whether we like him or not, again, objectively, that is a fact. Okay, so they attempted to, several groups tried to kill him several times. One of the most bombastic attempts was Operation Valkyrie, and there was a movie made about that. The attempt was made 14 times. This particular attempt was orchestrated by a group called the Kreisau Circle. The Kreisau Circle was formed by first liberal Masonic members that were also Catholics. One of them was Father Alfred Delp. And Father Alfred Delp, when he was 18, converted to Catholicism. He was raised Lutheran. 3 years later, he was out of seminary. He was already a Jesuit priest. So Father Alfred Delp was involved with this Kreisau Circle, and not only committing acts of sabotage, publishing a publication anonymously. All the writers published anonymously by name, and were constantly trying to gaslight, if not write false articles about what the German government was doing at the time, as well as undermining the traditional faith. So proactive Marxist and I would say Antifa membership and activities, because many of them were. In fact, Montini, who became Paul VI, had two parents that were members of the Antifa movement. And so he's raised in an Antifa household and became Pope. But regarding Father Alfred Delp, they failed in killing Hitler. And the group was composed of not just false Catholics, I believe to be false, but also Protestants, Masons, and Jewish Marxists. And so when one sees the extreme violent spectrum of Catholic activists, so-called Catholic activists at the time, and by the way, he was captured and summarily executed, properly so, then you would also see there are others that were committed to activism that didn't involve anything other than handing out flyers and trying to promote Marxism and other forms of government, even after the Reichskonkordat was issued. For non-Catholics, you have to understand, a Reichskonkordat issued means that the Pope is recognized as the legitimate leader of a country. When he's a legitimate leader of a country, you're supposed to support him. That's the whole point of issuing a concordat. It's historically, it goes back centuries and centuries. So when somebody's involved with not so violent activities, but also non-violent activities, they got involved with those Catholic centrist parties at the time, even before the election, the first election. And the first election occurred after he was already appointed by Hindenburg. So that's extremely important to understand. So when the question comes up, why were so many Protestants voting and voted Hitler in? Well, again, remember, he was already appointed as chancellor before he had to be re-voted back in, at least of the party, to stay in parliament or stay in the chancellorship. So many of the Catholics at the time were misled by some of the Catholic political activists, including, like I said, people like Father Alfred Delp. So if that's how I usually handle that question. I don't know if that helps at all, Servium. Trad Catholic Dixie, what's up, brother?
I invited him to speak. I'll go after him.
Right. Okay, so that covers, I think, the first section. So the first section was particularly about the definitions of fascism, National Socialism, and hey, brother.
There he goes.
Sorry, I was putting my phone to bed, but I'm here to listen for a little while.
Absolutely, brother. Yeah, we're just, like I said, we're just covering the definitions first of fascism, and then I'm going to go into section 2. And
something else I just wanted to quickly add to. Back in 1933 was in the Catholic Church of Germany at the time. That's when some of the priests started to do the first vernacular mass. So it was no longer in Latin. So again, we're getting this modernist infiltration that we see obviously into the present day, but even way back then in 1933. So that attests to the liberal nature of some of the clergy.
What I was going to go into is section 2, and it touches on this. So section 2, I mentioned that we're going to define the German philosophers, their worldviews, and whether or not they are the plausible origin of fascism and National Socialism. And again, all can find their origins in the four worldviews that stand in opposition to the Catholic worldview, right? And so let's kind of go into a few familiar names that people often talk about that were near and dear to, say, Hitler himself, as well as others, including Goebbels, including Streicher, and including others, and whether or not they are the plausible influences of the National Socialist, at least social policy, if not the politic itself. So first one that comes to mind with most people is Nietzsche. Okay. Now, let me just run down all the ones that I have written down in front of me, and you're going to hear that none of them are actually Catholic or Christian at all. Arthur Schopenhauer was a monist, right? Baruch Spinoza was a monist. Nietzsche was an atomist. Oswald Spengler was an atomist. Immanuel Kant was a dualist. Martin Heidegger was a monist, though very good philosopher, and I think still had a certain Catholic belief still. Julius Evola, dualist. Pythagoras was, ironically, very much influential on the German philosophers at the time, not just Epicurus. And he was a dualist, just like Plato, who was a Pythagorean student. So Plato, dualist. And guess what Karl Marx's political theory was? What was it based off of? What was his worldview based off of? His worldview was encapsulated into the atomist worldview, what's called the determinist branch, right? So he believed in absolute materialism, but that it had a will towards an outcome that's working itself out through time in the dialectic, which is ironic because if there's only atomism and it rejects metaphysics, spiritual beings, willfulness, and knowingness, and true being, then how can you have a will within material existing things? Where's that cosmic characteristics like the Buddhists say? There is none, right? So now Hitler was talked about as being, oftentimes by historians, as being absent of philosophical education, but that's actually not true at all. He said even in Mein Kampf, as well as in other experiences where friends conveyed this, that he was an avid reader. He himself was described as reading all night, oftentimes up until 3 or 4 in the morning, and then would sleep late and then have his breakfast by noon. And what was he reading? He was reading these philosophers, history books, Frederick the Great, all these philosophers that I mentioned. He was also Catholic. Was he the best Catholic? Well, growing up, he was extremely diligent, and it said that he died in a state of grace. But the point is that he was said to have carried a copy of Arthur Schopenhauer's works. So what was Arthur Schopenhauer's entirety of his worldview? The entirety of his worldview was not just monist, but influenced by Indian Brahmanism, right? And monism, Brahmanism, which is equivocal, basically says that there is no such thing as change in the universe. Therefore, there's only one substance to keep anything from changing. And he rejected the reality as we see it, which is typical of all monism. So reality is not real. And he developed a particular philosophy called pessimism, right? But here's the point. Most people think the will to power, the will to succeed, and the Triumph of the Will film based off of this concept came from Nietzsche. Actually, Nietzsche took it from Schopenhauer. So here's the unintelligibility of Schopenhauer's worldview in conclusion. How can you have a will to live, as he says, that exists in all of nature, if there's only one nature or essence or one thing? In that worldview, you don't even exist as a person. It's an illusion. Us talking here is illusory. So where's the will to live as the individual participle within a system of things? There isn't any. We're not really here. We're in the mind of the Logos acting out a play in his own mind. And that's if he is a he. What if it's a thing, like a general divine essence? So we know Arthur Schopenhauer could not have influenced what Hitler himself claimed to be, we are Christian. and declared, as we already pointed out in 24th point. You can't be Christian and believe in monism because you don't believe God is real. That would be a rejection of Christ and yourself and life. So why fight Marxism and Bolshevism spreading? It's not really happening. So Spinoza also was a monist, and so he was a Jewish philosopher that basically said there can be no real change. Okay, so he was also a monist. I've already rejected and refuted the monist worldview, but he wasn't a great influence on Third Reich thinkers, actually. Friedrich Nietzsche was an atomist. Again, atomism is a worldview that basically believes it's a rejection of anything after this life. The soul doesn't exist. There's no reincarnation. There's no going to heaven or hell. You just cease to exist after this life. And so it goes even further than the monism of Aristotle and the dualism of Plato. Oswald Spengler, as Martin Heidegger called, a cheap knockoff of Nietzsche. And Oswald Spengler was an atomist as well, just like Nietzsche. And ironically, it was Heidegger himself that pointed out the contradiction within Spengler's writings, where he says also there can be nothing new, which is another way of saying there can be no real change within a monistic worldview. But he also comes across and says, what I'm introducing is something new. So he contradicts himself within his own writings. Immanuel Kant, although good in refuting David Hume's complete abandonment of forms, universal forms, Catholicos, and the rejection of metaphysics in general, Immanuel Kant was influential somewhat, just like Schopenhauer somewhat, on Heidegger definitely, but also just like Hegel, Hitler, and some of the writers of the time. But again, his worldview ends up in a dualistic position. And he even wanted to reorder the entire church, get rid of dogmatism, establish some type of ethical republic, basically nullifying the existence of Catholicism as it was at the time, and try to bring a unity of Christianity by abandoning dogma and abandoning the church as we see it. So it's actually very democratic in nature, which is kind of backwards. So Martin Heidegger was a monist. Although he professed some type of a belief in the Christian God, he wanted to also reinterpret his own ideas of what that actually meant. And his philosophy was very sound in a lot of ways, outside of a rejection of having a true appeal to authority in a metaphysical transcendental sense. As in, do I have access to the forms through the mind of the Logos by thinking God's thoughts after him? Well, he didn't think that, right? He actually thought that we are to place philosophy above all things, including rationality, not rationalism, which makes the man the autonomy of his own authority. But he also promoted the idea that we should have philosophy above all things. But what philosophy, though? He just means philosophy as in the study of it. But when you come to a definitive conclusion, like Catholic philosophy does, he wanted to avoid such dogmatic, like Kant, dogmatic positions. Right? Of course, Julius Evola, he was a dualist. Pythagoras, although important, was also a dualist. Right? And I'll go into his important contribution to both the philosophical schools of the past. He was the preeminent beginner of an understanding of what that logos might be, an intermediary between an immovable first cause, the Father, and an intermediary between the Father or heaven or the monad and the world of forms or creation. So as I've demonstrated here, it's not plausible to be both pagan or possess one of these four particular worldviews and also be fascist or nationalist or even monarchistic while also saying, I want to fight Marxism, when you share Marxist same exact worldview. Then you're just competing for the same prize. And eventually you'll just look over and say, why are we fighting? We're pursuing the same thing, although we don't know why we're pursuing it, because we're actually not really here. So, and even if you are of another branch of atomism or pragmatism, we say, I'm actually really here. I don't care whether or not this is real. I just want to get mine. it still ends up in the same place. You share so many characteristics with the Marxist socialists that you shouldn't be fighting. You should be collectivizing and fighting against Christians who are holding mankind back. And so, again, you lose all justification for staying in a fight to the death to save Christian Europe. And that's the opposite of what the Third Reich, Mussolini's fascist government, and really any other leader of right-wing politics of the time was fighting for, right? They got targeted by the Masons and the communists and everybody else against them. So what was the commonality amongst all those other beliefs? Well, we already established. Masonry is also a dualistic nature. Empiricism is either monistic, dualistic, or atomistic. And those are the ingredients of England at that time. They were definitely in opposition to that fifth worldview we already talked about that was rooted in Christianity, Christian philosophy. So, all right, so there's a third subject after this, but anybody else have any questions or want to add anything real quick before we move on? Okay, so the third section we were talking about going into was the origin of the swastika, or what Pythagoras labeled the tetractys, and how and why Pythagoras chose this symbol to convey the unification between heaven and man. So for those that don't know, Pythagoras was a pre-Socratic philosopher. That would be before Plato, before Socrates. And he was instrumental in creating the mathematical theorem of pi, as well as the Pythagorean theorem of geometry and so forth. And he was instrumental in identifying the importance of numbers. He was also an ascetic, where he would also go into prayer and meditation and so forth. And it said that he was probably more instrumental in helping spread this concept of meditative practice, study of numbers, as well as using this particular symbol I'll go into in a second, that we now know as the swastika, that he described as being a description of the logos, or the intermediary between heaven and earth. And so as this belief system spread, it's my theory that it spread east and created the environment that birthed Buddhism, because the first images of Buddhism in Indo-Aryan belief systems and religions, including the images of the first, the first images of Sakyamuni were of Caucasian in nature, bearded face, curly hair, white skin, that kind of stuff. So I shared in my timeline on Twitter some articles about Pythagoras' theory on the model of the universe, and how he explained the origin of all things was the monad. So his philosophy was that there is the monad, which is the general divine essence, not necessarily a person. And this grand monad was not only, this grand monad generated a dyad. Okay, so he's always going through mathematical formulas. So this dyad he called the window into heaven. Into infers a created essence. And that created essence came into existence from the monad through the dyad and created the triad, or the forms of all things. And these triads make up the particles that make up all things. So it's almost like the beginning of atomism, but not quite atomism yet, right? And so he developed a symbol to convey this entire thought of the dyad called the tetrachites. I'm not saying that right, but what we know now as the swastika. And we know that the earliest forms of this symbol go back actually in the Western world, not in the East. And so as it traveled into India, especially upon Alexander the Great's conquering during Aristotle's time, and Asia in general, you began to see this symbol in other religious rituals and pagan practices and so forth. And when it came into existence in Catholicism, it existed and was used before even the adoption of the crucifix. It was found in catacombs throughout Christian Rome, even into the first century. And later on, it came to be known as the Hakenkreuz. But for the Greeks, it represented both Pythagoras, Heraclitus, as well as Plato, and my baptismal saint, Saint Justin Martyr, who was a Pythagorean and a Platonist and became Christian because he understood finally what this logos was. It wasn't just this symbol that was trying to represent the divinity, intermediary and omnipresent divinity. It was a person. So it wasn't a thing, it was a person. right? That's a very profound thing for the earliest, probably one of the, if not the earliest Christian philosopher, being Justin Martyr. And in his apologies, he actually uses a lot of these presuppositional apologetics to refute the pagan belief that they held at the time, to show that it's actually you being immoral by persecuting us who are virtuous. That was his argumentation, right? And so that was very much implied, if not explicit, by his writings, but came to be of use of other Christian writers later on. So, and of course, by the time the German era, and I don't mean German era as a modern era, I mean when Germany was finally converted, they constantly used this symbol from both a pagan use as German, Norse pagan, from Roman pagan use, and its origins coming back to the Greek philosophers. And now they used it as a Christian symbol to represent the logos, this Haken Cruz or hooked cross, and its connection to the logos as the tetrachites. So if you go actually into one of the most important paintings in Western history, and that's Raphael's School of Athens, you can see Plato at the center standing next to Aristotle. And in front of him is Pythagoras sitting down on the ground. But his hands show one hand pointing up and one hand pointing down. Before there was the four-armed hooked cross, there was the two-armed that Pythagoras first started. And you see above the archway in this painting, all above all the people in that entire painting, especially right at the center, Plato, is this early form of the swastika, of the hooked cross. Now, I've been all over Europe, so I've seen these two different types of hooked cross, the two-armed and the one-armed, intertwined in a continuing pattern. But the reason why it's important during the Renaissance to apply is because even they knew the philosophical importance of the connection up and down between man and God. And of course, that symbol represents that connection, which is the intermediary Christ. So they didn't lose that early Christian and even the attempt to understand Greek pagan philosophers, understanding that there's somebody in between the immovable Father, which is the true first cause, and the divinity that created us and cares for us. What's that intermediary? Well, it says right in John 1, right? The Logos. Everything was created through him and for him. And he was God. He was the Word and God himself. So that was very important. And why is it important? Because as I also shared in the chat, a slideshow of pics of the Fascisti. And ironically, if you see the slides in the chat, the Fascisti is also used not just in ancient times to signify unity, as it applies to the Stoics and the militaristic utilitarian philosophies, but it also shows a unity of principles. In other words, a declaration of an intelligible worldview by unified principles. So it was a philosophical symbol before it was a wartime symbol. And that's why it's used also in political application, not just by Mussolini. You can see in the U.S. Congress, right at the chair of the Speaker of the House, you have two fascisti on each side. And just like the School of Athens, an archway above the Speaker's chair of this tetrachites, right? This swastika. So these are considered by the propagandists of the World War II era as being symbols of hate, yet they reside exactly in the U.S. Congress to this day. So it proves that you can convey these concepts even in a republic, because as Socrates said in Plato's Republic, that a republic is a monarchy, right? And it's an authoritarian form of government, but it's not a malevolent form of government. It is tempered by the philosopher king with these universal Catholicos principles. So I thought that was pretty profound, because it took years for me to come to understand the origins and the use of this symbol in the flag and the symbology of the Third Reich. And he didn't take it, as some try to claim on History Channel, from Hinduism. He wasn't influenced by Hinduism. That was Schopenhauer. He rejected Hinduism. He professed Catholicism. And so when he grew up in that church in Lumbach as a choir boy, going to Mass, going to every Vespers, doing the Rosary, doing everything else you can possibly think of as being an active Catholic, as he described, then he also described in Mein Kampf and other places going to that same church that had a Benedictine symbol that can be seen all over Europe. I saw those in Fusan, I saw them in Munich, and I saw them also in Rothenburg and many different places. And that was that particular form of the Hakenkreuz, a Catholic symbol. And that was the influence. It was Catholic in origin why he put that symbol on the flag of the nation. Right? So my complaint years ago in coming to the understanding of this knowledge was, why, if it was so Catholic, why didn't he use a Catholic symbol on the flag? And when I realized he did, then that tells you something. Now, this isn't an advocation for National Socialism. I myself believe in monarchism, but we have to have an understanding of how to go from where we're at now in this false democracy as an intermediary form of government. My personal political philosophy is integralism, that is Catholic integralism. But my argument is that fascism is the manifest implementation of Catholic principles, therefore Catholic integralism. But remember, like I said in episode 1, a political philosophy itself is only a philosophy that does not speak about how its implementation can be enacted. That's the job of a party, right? So you have the National Socialist German Workers' Party. That's what they tried to do. Whether they failed at it or not, or they screwed up, or there was all kinds of bad things that happened, has nothing to do with whether or not the politic is sound. And that is an ad hominem attack everybody tries to use as a genetic attack upon anything that they're talking about, right? So if a sound reasoning and an intelligible worldview is put forth, and one or many within that worldview try to implement it in a way and they commit wrongdoings in doing so, you don't say that that particular worldview is wrong. You don't say algebra is wrong because you learned it from a guy that you later found out was a serial rapist. Now all algebra should be not touched. That's also an ad hominem. So that's why we're examining this. That's why we're talking about this. It was not a pagan symbol. I hear people say, oh, but he took it from Buddhism, and the Buddhism goes the opposite direction. He took it in the other way, and therefore it was a hateful symbol. I mean, I have no idea what they're talking about. So anybody have anything wanted to add about that? Because I have a couple more points I'm going to address on this and then move on to 4 and then conclude. Okay. So anyway, I thought that was extremely profound to discover, and not in my mind, but in objective reality that refutes the ability for a pagan or an anti-Catholic philosophy and worldview to be the origin of both the symbology as well as the party itself and its philosophical principles, right? And that's pretty profound. So the question really comes into play then, what was Hitler's existing worldview? And as I've already touched on, he declared himself as a Catholic. He declared himself as such. And I already talked about how he grew up in Austria and Lambach, served as a choir boy, a server. And anybody that's not Catholic, they understand what an involved life being a Catholic is. He was described as an adult, how very religious he was. He described also, he believed he had an appearance of the Blessed Virgin Mary while in the foxhole and fighting in World War I. He was described by Protestants that visited him in a pejorative as a papist, since he had icons and iconography, meaning statues, crosses in his homes. This is the same thing I found with Ludwig II's homes, right? When I visited Bavaria. And you never hear about that. You never hear how every bedroom he ever slept in, he had an icon of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And that goes to the point of the Austrian painter's history. He has paintings that were very reverent of both churches, Blessed Virgin Mary and baby Christ child, as well as many other religious paintings. So again, whether or not he was a good Catholic has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with where did he get his ideas from. And it's not the Vril Society. It's not some weird theosophy society and so forth. It was Catholicism, right? So, and that teaches us a lesson also to be very astute and dedicated in our studies. And one of the things that he described in Mein Kampf about studying things was the ability to know how to study. And when you study and read something, you are to extrapolate from that something that is useful. The inability to recognize what is useful and what is useless was the difference between the well-read and learned man and the one who just reads volume upon volume, but never retains anything because he doesn't have a starting point. If you're Catholic, you already have a worldview that you start from. So when you read something from a belief of a Catholic, like there is no hell, then somebody that's writing that, you say, well, obviously I don't believe that. You're reading Schopenhauer. Oh, I believe in reincarnation. Well, I don't believe that. But when he says there's a will to live in all things, that's true. That's objectively demonstrable. So the ability to extrapolate that and use it for a concept of saying we have to have the determination and will to fight for the existence of Christian Europe against the communists, against anybody else that's trying to destroy us. Now, is that specifically an Arthur Schopenhauer worldview? No. It's a Christian worldview. It's a Catholic understanding of things, right? So that to me is a very unfortunate thing that's lost on a lot of people and they don't recognize it because they don't truly understand Catholicism. And a lot of them don't understand Catholicism because they've lost the ability or the appetite to study the Christian philosophers, like the Cappadocian Fathers, like Saint Basil, like Chrysostom, like John of Damascus, the first millennium fathers. If that's all you had, you would be an incredible Catholic, as in understanding. Your dedication to the life is something different than the understanding, but your understanding would be incredibly great, right? Because that was at a time when you still had the Imperium. And so when you have Eusebius describing Constantine and how it's a copy of the divine original, the kingdom of heaven, then he's endorsing monarchism. But within monarchism, you still have authoritarianism. You have totalitarianism. You have absolute monarchy. And so that's exactly how the kingdom of God is. So it copies that. That's the Third Reich didn't even go that far. He abdicated the concept of a totalitarian absolute monarchy, right? And people reject that idea because they call him dictator, but dictators are not elected. So the point is that there was an entirety of government. It's that they were all unified in principle is the point. So you didn't need somebody as a dictator breathing over your shoulder every 2 seconds telling you what to do. If you were properly vetted and educated and also willfully sought the same end goal, then you didn't need to be locked behind walls with machine guns like in Soviet Russia. You commonly pursued that end. And that's what was going on. That's why it was so successful. That's why he didn't need, armed men around him constantly. People were hugging him and kissing him and parading around him with I would say hardly any threats of assassination from his own people, at least. The people that were trying to kill him were foreign people. So, okay, so that leads us to section 4. Did we have any written questions or commentary? So the fourth section that I'm referring to is why we can definitively conclude that fascism and the Third Reich are rooted in Christian philosophy, specifically Catholic. So it seems like a bold claim, but let me explain. So, like I said, we've already established that all the other modern philosophers stem from those worldviews that stand in opposition to and have created an atmosphere that allows atheism, opposition to Catholicism, but allows an atmosphere of atheists and agnostics and absolute materialists and determinists to grow, like Karl Marx, right? And if one doesn't truly believe in the Catholic worldview, he actually shares the same worldview and end purpose, or teleos, as the materialistic philosophies like Karl Marx. So there's no reason for them, when times get tough, to not jump ship. So what is it specifically about the Christian, or more specifically the Catholic worldview, that would be different than the monist or the dualist or atomist or pragmatist worldviews? Well, briefly stated, the Catholic worldview does not comport to any one of those four in any way other than a few common characteristics, such as recognizing there is a first cause, yet he's a person and not a thing, not a general divine essence, as the Greeks believed, or some of the German philosophers believed, like Schopenhauer. Catholic philosophy and theology believes, which was exactly what Hitler believed, Mussolini, Franco believed, Leon Degrelle believed, and other fascists, that there is not a cosmic cycle of things or a reincarnation of things, where everything goes through birth, stasis, degeneration, destruction, and rebirth, and therefore nullifies an nihilistic perspective doing good here at all, because the saint and the sinner is rewarded the same, total annihilation at the end of the cosmos. It's not a belief system that espouses a rejection of the world as real. We truly are here. We don't believe this realm is illusory, but it's part of the equation of our eternity. And Hitler said something about that. The European Christian, he called Aryan, but he is referring to the European Christian mentality, prepares for the afterlife by living this life in accordance with a particular set of values. So he lives this life in preparation for the next life, is what he was saying, for eternity. Total opposite of the materialist. However, I'd say that the chief characteristic that the Catholic worldview possesses is its ability to use transcendental arguments, as popularized by Immanuel Kant in the modern era, and other non-Catholic philosophers such as Dr. Gregory Bahnsen and Cornelius Van Til, which are both Presbyterians, by the way, but they're using transcendental arguments and presuppositional apologetics like St. Justin Martyr and so many other Catholics. It's just revived by non-Catholics because it's been somewhat abandoned by many Catholics in general. Now, it is true we use empirical data, but we're not empiricists. We use rational proofs, but we're not rationalists, where we use the autonomy of man as the appeal to authority. And we use pragmatic proofs, but our argument is such that we can't make sense of all those methods of reasoning, because all those methods of reasoning and worldviews resort eventually back down to subjectivism, since all of them reject objective truths. All of them reject that there are eternal, unchanging, objective truths. And that's the point. So if they all reject an appeal to authority that is transcendental in nature, and that there are unchangeable universal principles, then they don't appeal to anything other than themselves with their own perception, as Bertrand Russell would talk about. And that would be, like I said, the autonomy of man, the individual. And the problem with the autonomy of man argument is that he can never be on the same page as somebody else, nor can he be sure that what he's observing is both real, the rejection of reality, since it changes, or you evolve into a nominalist where everything may be variably different. Therefore, there's no human nature. Therefore, human nature is always changing. The constantly changing universe, right? There's a major problem with that. But here's the other problem. They also, in the scientific process, use the inductive process. The inductive process presupposes a uniformity or a standardized position of all things in nature. And if you abandon that belief system, that things are forms that are unchangeable, like the laws of logic don't ever change, like numbers don't ever change, and you reject that, then you don't have a justification for using the inductive process. So if you can't use the inductive process, how are you supposed to use any scientific studies to come to a conclusive result on anything? That's where we're in a scientific anarchy right now, because they eventually realized that. And they said, instead of digging back in and saying, yes, like Bertrand Russell, yes, we don't have enough epistemology yet to understand why we use the inductive process. I don't accept that there are objective truths, and truth is always changing, relativism, but I'm going to presuppose I can use the inductive process for now. But we know for sure the Christians are not correct. And I thought that's funny, because he knows for sure that somebody that claims to know for sure doesn't know for sure. That's the philosophical joke that Bertrand Russell ran himself into. You can't know anything for sure, but I know for sure the Christians aren't right on saying that we have objective truths. And that's the problem. So how can you definitively declare certain things that those living during that time of the Third Reich, or in great monarchies of the past, or the great philosophers of the past, or those trying to hold on to tradition, mainly in Catholic circles, some Orthodox, some Protestant circles? How can you do that unless you believe that there are unchangeable things? And here's the problem. Protestants don't believe in general. Almost all of them don't believe in a universal experience of Christ. They believe in a personal experience with Christ. Why do I say that? Because if justification is done through a process of wanting to be saved, and therefore even circumventing the necessity for baptism, and I can never lose my salvation, then what kind of society do you have where people say, then I can still cheat on my wife, steal, murder, get away with it because I'm still saved? So why wouldn't I do these things? I'm still saved. Your personal experience means that it's different than what it says in the actual scriptures and the saints and the church fathers, the patristics. So how can your experience of saying thou shalt not murder is the same as the next person that believes I shall not murder, therefore I won't murder? Then you're back to what? Subjectivism. Catholicism, as its traditional historical state, does not say that the subjective reasoning of the individual is the appeal to authority. The deposit of faith that is unchangeable is. This is why we reject the declarations of the Novus Ordo, because they also subject the church's teachings to a changeable subjective status. And that's why you can't have a powerful government that claims to be positively Christian, Catholic in nature, that is anything other than Catholic, because Catholicos, or Catholic, which is our original name, rooted in that philosophical concept, that we have access to the true forms of things because God thinks all things into existence. And when I think God's thoughts after him, I have access to those forms that are unchangeable. And we know they're unchangeable because his mind is unchangeable. He is unchangeable. Therefore, the things that he thinks into existence, like the forms of all things rooted in his mind, are also unchangeable. Politically implied, that means that when you root yourself in Catholic political philosophy, you are rooting yourself in something that cannot be subjective. And all other forms of thinking, systems of thought, paganism, monism, whether or not paganism conforms to these, which many of them do, monism, dualism, atomism, and pragmatism, all resort back down to the subjective reasoning of things. And that's why it's failure. And that's how we can prove that Catholicism is the source. Catholic integralism as its political philosophy that existed for a very long time. It is basically the politic of the Catholic king, the implementation of Christian principles in the public space and the protection of those that are sharing those single principles of unity. That is Catholic politics. So we know that to be the architecture that was in the mind of existing Catholics like Mussolini, Hitler, Gottfried Feder, and others. Oswald Spengler even too, or I'm sorry, not Oswald. Oswald Mosley too. He was Catholic, and his fascism was rooted in Catholic principles that he knew to be unchangeable. So that is the point. That's how we can know that this politic is rooted in Catholicism, Catholic philosophy, and Catholic politics. And that's my argumentation.